All right, cool. So, welcome back to Logic, Lecture 11. What we're going to do today is our second part of modal logic. So here's the specific plan. I want to do a quick refresher on the kind of syntax of ML, our third and final formal language. So just a reminder about the kind of grammar of how to build sentences in this, because we didn't talk about it last week because I was sick. So it's just a kind of reminder about how the language looks. Like, what does an ML sentence look like? And that'll take us like 5 minutes. It's just a reminder. Then I want to turn in our second section to talk about ML interpretations. And it's worth noting that this name, right, is the same as the kind of thing we used for FOL in the first half of the course, but ML interpretations are fundamentally different kinds of beasts. In some sense, what they are is a combination between evaluation and a location. So it's according to some place this valuation holds. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then once we have a grip on what ML interpretations look like, we'll build or present semantics for our various modal systems. Because if you remember, we had 4 different modal logic systems: K, T, S4, and S5. And once we actually talk through ML interpretations, we can get clear on what the difference between these systems actually is, where it comes from, and why we want to have 4 different systems. So that'll be basically the core of the content, and then we'll wrap up by talking about what we're going to do in the last 2 lectures. Sounds good? Beautiful. So let's rock and roll. We'll start with a refresher on ML. And again, this is just to kind of like, hey, remember there's this third formal language. So ML is basically TFL with a little bit more bells and whistles. TFL, there were 3 kinds of symbols. We had atoms, connectives, and brackets. In ML, we have 4 kinds of symbols. Atoms, capital letters, possibly with subscripts. The connectives, the same 5 from TFL. Brackets, hey, cool, just like they did before. And then finally, the big addition are 2 modal operators, the box and the diamond. And again, we're reading the box as basically saying something like, it's necessary that, and we're reading the diamond as saying something like, it's possible that. But it is worth noting that we don't have to read it this way. And in fact, one of the things we'll come back to is reinterpreting these in other ways. So then we can say, cool, an expression of ML is any string of these symbols. But an expression isn't a sentence. We want to know, when do you get a sentence, right? And the answer here is pretty straightforward. The sentence construction rules for ML are almost exactly like with TFL. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize it. Importantly, this is basically just the same box that Michael gave you for TFL, right? It's just, hey, atoms are sentences. If you have a sentence, you can stick a negation in front. If you have 2 sentences, you can put a conjunction or a disjunction or a conditional or a biconditional. The only thing that's new here is 7 and 8. 7 tells us if you have a sentence, you can put a box in front of it. 8 tells us if you have a sentence, you can put a diamond in front of it. Now, notably, the thing here is, and this we talked a little bit about, this also means these 2 sentence construction rules mean that you can get iterated modal operators. So if you have a sentence with a box in front of it, well, you can stack another box in front. And that gives you some interesting things to think about, right? We talked about this last time. So is something that's necessarily true necessarily necessary? That is every situation it's going to be necessary, or is it, something that could kind of slip away? So we're going to talk a little bit about that once we get into the ML interpretations. But this is the language, right? We build sentences. They look a hell of a lot like the TFL sentences. You can just slap boxes and diamonds in front. Cool. Okay. So we've got the grammar. Now we need to think about, when are they true or false? How do we assess ML sentences? And this gets us to ML interpretations. So when are ML sentences true or false? And it's worth noting that this is a different kind of thing than the natural deduction system. Because importantly, natural deduction systems don't actually concern themselves with sentences being true or false. We assume sentences, and then we have natural deduction rules that let us syntactically manipulate them. And we can talk about them loosely being true or false, right, on the proof line, or their negation being on the proof line. But that's just a rough way of speaking. We don't really have a tool to tell us when they're true or false. And the big idea with ML, the semantics for ML, is that we're going to add a kind of location. We're going to relativize truth. So we're going to say that an ML sentence isn't just true or false simplicator, right, just on its own, but it's going to be true or false at a given world. So an ML sentence might be true at one world, it might be false at another, it might be true at every world, it might be false at every world. You can kind of think about this roughly as something like, okay, here's a very simple analogy. Worlds are people. And then true at is basically believes. So we can now talk about, hey, what does he believe? What does he believe? What does she believe? What do I believe? Right? And that's the kind of way we might relativize. So it's true according to Nathan. It's true according to you. It's true according to you. Note that if we relativize in that way, it doesn't really make sense to talk about just true. It's always going to be true relative to. So that's the big thought. We're going to basically have something like valuations, but they're always going to be valuations relative to a world. Hey guys. What this is going to let us do, and we talked a little bit about this in the last tutorial, is our box and diamond, our modal operators, are going to turn out to be a little bit like quantifiers. So the box is going to be something very much like at every world. And the diamond is going to be something like at some world. Now this is going to be complicated a little bit, but this is the rough and ready thing lurking behind the ML interpretations. So that's the kind of loose sketch. Let's try and firm it up some. So an interpretation of ML is a 3-element set. This is just being very formal. We'll give the informal gloss. It's a 3-element set. It has 3 parts. It's got W, which is going to be a collection of worlds. It's got V, which is a valuation function. And it's got R, which is our accessibility relation. We're going to go through those one by one. But basically, to build an interpretation of ML, you have to give all 3. Super roughly, W is going to be your kind of locations, your places of assessment. V is going to tell you, hey, what non-modal sentences are true at various worlds. And R gives you the relationship between the various worlds. So let's talk about them one by one. First, we have W. It's a non-empty collection of possible worlds. Now, what exactly possible worlds are is a deep philosophical question, one that people are still debating about, one that I'm really interested in. But we can kind of dodge that for now. For the logical aspect, we don't really care. We can think about them just as collections of sentences. We can think about them as sort of boxes on a fucking slideshow. We don't really care. All they need to be is something that can be used to represent certain things being true or not true. So really, they could be individuals, they could be locations, they could be anything you want. But for our purposes, we can just think about them as collections of sentences. So we have worlds, and these worlds are going to be our cornerstone. We need at least one for any interpretation. Can't get by with none. So in that sense, it's kind of like what we had with domains. If you remember back in FOL, Michael told you, you cannot have an empty domain in first order logic. You can't have an empty domain of possible worlds. You need at least one world of assessment. So there's our first bit, but it's kind of boring. Our next bit is the big big step. So our valuation function, V. The valuation function is, as its name suggests, a function. What it does is it takes in sentence word combinations and then assigns truth values. So we might take a sentence S, right? Nathan's sweater's black. And our valuation function will take S and a given possible world, so world 1, for example, for our first one, and assign S to true. Basically, you can think about it as, right, world 1 believes that S is true. At S, or at world 1, S is tagged to true. Contrast, our valuation function at world 2 assigns S false. We can think about this valuation function in lots of different ways, right? It could just be, hey, cool, tell me what you believe. And if you believe something, then if we're taking people as our worlds, then your believing it will mean the valuation function assigns that sentence to true. If you don't believe it, to false. Or if it's a location, right? Does it have a McDonald's? If it does, cool, then sentence M gets true. If it doesn't, then it gets false. Doesn't really matter. Should note, in the reading, it uses ones and zeros instead of true and false. I just thought it might be a little bit easier to have it written as like big true versus big false. But it could be ones and zeros. It doesn't really matter. So a valuation function, again, assigns truth values to atomic sentences at a world. Note, it only assigns truth values to atoms. This is why it's valuations, right? It's just like what we did way back with truth tables. We're saying, hey, at this world, these atoms are true and these atoms are false. Of course, if it only gives you the truth value of atoms, how are we going to do the complex sentences? Because remember, ML is also built up using the connectives. So how are the connectives going to work? Well, just like they fucking did with TFL. Right? Exactly like with TFL. So this is kind of hideous looking, but all this is telling you is that the connectives work just like they did. Right? So for our first one, a negation of a sentence is true if and only if its unnegated sentence is false, and vice versa. So if the valuation function, if the valuation function assigns S to false, then that means at that world, negation S is true. Again, just like what we did with TFL, negation's a flipper. Whatever the atom's truth value assigned to it is, well, negation then flips it to the other one. No problem. But note again, it's always relativized, so it's at that world. And then conjunction works just like conjunction does. A conjunction B is going to be true at a world if and only if the two conjuncts are both true at the world. Disjunction is going to be true if even one of the disjuncts is true at the world. The conditional is true if the antecedent's false or the consequence true, or maybe both. And finally, biconditional, unsurprising, it's going to be true at a world if and only if the two sides have the same truth value at the world. Nothing shocking here, right? All this should be familiar. So in effect, right, just like we had with truth tables, the complex sentences, when we think about the connectives, are going to be behaving in this sort of assigned way. Truth flows upwards, but it's always truth at a world. Okay. And of course, it also still means that sentences can be true, and complex sentences can be true in one world and false in another. Okay. So far, so good. So note, we've already got ways to figure out two of the three kinds of sentences we're going to have. Atoms, to go back a slide, atoms will be true or false in the world just because the valuation function says they are, by stipulation. Complex sentences featuring the connectives are going to be true or false just like they were with TFL. The third kind of sentence we have are complex sentences featuring our box and diamond. And to make sense of those, this is where the world relativization actually kicks in. Because so far, nothing really matters about that, right? So to understand how we're going to treat our box and diamond, we have to talk about the third part of an ML interpretation. And our third part is the accessibility relation. So an accessibility relation is literally a relation, right? It's at least a two-place predicate. And it tells us which worlds can access or see each other. And note, see here is again kind of metaphorical, but we can think about it this way. The accessibility relation tells us what possibilities, what situations are reachable from where we are, relative to one world. So, world 1 can see all the worlds that it's going to be connected to via accessibility, and then our next world along is going to be connected to all the worlds it can access. And they might be different connections. Here's a really simple and silly example. Right? We could take each person in this room as a possible world, take the collection of their beliefs as what's then assigned on our valuation function, and accessibility will be determined by who you can reach. So note, what we're going to have is some interesting accessibility networks. There's a big cluster that can kind of all over here. There's a little cluster in the back. There are some ones that, well, there's not going to be a whole lot of connections. And that's fine, because our model here, our system, is flexible enough to accommodate that. But again, you can kind of see the idea. So with accessibility, this connectivity, we can then define how to understand boxes and diamond talking at worlds. So box A is going to be true at a given world if and only if every world that it can access is an A world. Right? So box A is true at a given world if and only if everything it's connected to, A is true. Contrast with the diamond. Diamond A is true at a world if and only if there's at least one world it's connected to where A is true. So, an easy joke, right? Again, if we take the kind of connectivity things here, we might talk about accessing the wonderful white hat, right? And if we think about maybe this group, depending on how we understand accessibility, these all might have it, right? White hat is accessible. But for like this group back here, again, if we're thinking about like physical touch, that's not going to work. So diamond's white hat isn't going to be true back there because there's not even one kind of world that they could access. Do we see the basic idea here? It's lovely. It's so wonderful. So what you have is, again, worlds, locations. Yeah, please.
How do you know which world can access which world?
Good. So this is one of the neat things, is our system, we can basically define this accessibility relation as we like. It's a system, right? So we're kind of building up a model as we go. So we could either try and capture what's already there, like in this case, right, where we're going to model where people are sitting and go from there, or we can just construct models that we think will represent stuff. In that sense, it's very similar to the interpretations of FOL we built before, where you're not necessarily constrained by what's actually the case. You can build the model however you want the model to go. Good. Okay. But again, we see the kind of general line here. So worlds are going to be these, yeah, we don't really care what they are metaphysically, but they're kind of representations of situations where atoms can be true or false. Their truth or falsity are determined by your valuation function. And then complex sentences are defined either just simply like they were with TFL or via accessibility relations. what the worlds can see relative to each other. Questions before we go on? Please.
What did you mean by truth flows upwards?
Good. So this is the kind of idea when we're thinking about TFL, right? Truth flows upwards in the sense that we fix the truth or falsity of the atoms, and then it determines the next level of complexity upwards. And then that level determines the next level of complexity upwards until we hit the main logical operator. That's the idea. You can also think about it flowing downwards if you like, but whatever. Basically, the smallest parts determine the next level until you hit the ML. Thanks. Okay. Other questions? We feeling good with this? It's incredibly intuitive in a way. And in a way. The nice thing is if we already know how to do truth tables, then you've got 80% of it. It's just going to be, hey, I can do one table over here, I can do another table over here, or partial tables, and then draw some connections between. So this gives us our approach for all the kinds of sentences we would have for ML. If they're atoms, they're true at a given world simply by stipulation because of the valuation function. If they're complex using the connectives, it's determined in the TF-LE way. And if they're complex sentences whose main operators are boxes and diamonds, those are going to be determined by the accessibility relations. Yeah.
I still don't see what it was like to be linked into the world.
Good. So it's literally just it's a stipulation that you have this accessibility relation. We're not really worried about what accessibility is metaphysically. You can just think about it as standing in any kind of relation. Could be physical touch. It could be able to see. It could be can talk to.
So you're just looking for it.
Yeah. It's just a link. It is just a link. And the important thing for us, right, we don't care, again, what the physical or metaphysical representation of the link is. It's just, does the link hold? And does it connect you to a world where something is true or false? So what we can do is start to produce diagrammatic interpretations. So here's a very quick and dirty diagrammatic interpretation. We have two possible worlds. We've got 1 and 2. And we can represent atoms being true at the world. If the atom's in there, the atom's true. If it's negations there, the atom's false. Then we can have the arrows, and the arrows represent accessibility. So if we look at world 1, it can see 2 worlds. It can see itself, because it's got that loop in the corner, and it can see 2. How many worlds can 2 see?
1.
Just 1, right? It can only see world 1. It cannot see itself. If the arrow ain't there, the access isn't there. This is, again, to drive home. Accessibility is just an arrow. It's just a relation that we can define as we like. So with this, just toy interpretation, we can start to assess various ML claims. So let's just take our first one here. So we've got A conjunction B. Is A conjunction B true at W1? Yeah, right? Both conjuncts are true, so the conjunction's true. How about A conditional B at W2?
Yeah.
It's true, right? Why is it true?
Because the antecedent's false.
Yeah, antecedent's false, right? And in any world or any circumstance where the antecedent's false, conditional is always true. So far, so good? How about, so let's just stick with this one. Let's change the worlds. Is A conditional B true at world 1?
Yeah.
Note, if we're looking at these kinds of sentences, all we have to do is just look at what's going on in the world. And in world 1, A is true, B is true, so our conditional is true. Yeah, please.
So you always assume what is in the world is true.
Yeah. If it's in the box, if it's in the box, it's true. If it's negations in the box, it's false. So in world 2, A is false because not A is true.
No.
What if it would be a box instead of diamond?
Good. We're going to talk about it in a second. We so far so good? We got the real simple ones, right? Again, if we're thinking of sentences that do not feature modal operators, you don't need to look anywhere other than the world of assessment. So let's take our diamond A, right? Is diamond A true at world 1?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's possible to be true.
Tell me why. So specifically, why is it?
Because in some of the worlds in which it can access, A is true.
And which world can it access where A is true? I think this is what you were saying.
Yeah.
Right?
Its own world.
Itself, right? It can see world 1. It can arrow world 1, and in world 1, A is true. So far, so good. How about diamond A in world 2? Is diamond A in world 2 true?
No.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, well,
Hmm. So if we look at world 2, can it see a world where A is true? Which world is it? World 1. Cool. Second question. Yeah, I think you were answering the next question. Is diamond not A true in world 2? It's interesting.
nee, want hij kan die andere zien.
Yeah, it can't see itself, right? Every world that W2 can see is an A world. Because it doesn't have an arrow to itself. So is diamond not A true in world 2? Cool. Is box not A true in world 2? What does the box require again? So that's what it says, but thinking about it in terms of truth or falsity, right? What does our semantics require? Yeah?
But in every world in which it can see is
True. Nice. So, in every world that W2 can see, is not A true? Right? Because in fact, what is true in every world that world 2 can see?
A.
So what box sentence is true at world 2? Box A, right? Box A is true because in every world that 2 can see, every world that 2 can see is an A world. So box A, W2, is true. Do we see it? Kind of cool. Okay. How about box A at world 1? Is box A true at world 1?
No.
And why not?
Because it can see world 2.
It can see world 2, and world 2 is a not A. So here's why, right? Again, we can look and see at the arrows. The arrows indicate access. So if there's an arrow that starts in 1 and points to 2, which we've got, right? It starts at 1 and it points to 2. It can access, it can see world 2, and at world 2, not A is the case, because not A is in the box. Yes?
But how would you then explain in world 2 that not A is also true?
Yeah. That's weird, right?
Yeah.
So there's something very strange in that box A is true at world 2, but not A is also true at world 2. And that's strange. This is already kind of hitting something that we talked about, right? We're playing around at this point in system K. And K doesn't let us go from box to unbox. So, cool. We're going to talk about what you need to do to make sure this kind of weird situation doesn't happen. So here's another good one. Is this sentence true at 2? Well, let's think. What's the main operator of this sentence? It's a conjunction, right? It's the main operator here is the conjunction. Does everybody see it, right? The main operator is our conjunction. So, if the conjunction is going to be true at world 2, right, that means both conjuncts have to be true at world 2. And is box B true at world 2? We've already assessed that box A is. Is box B also true?
Yeah.
Cool. So, is our conjunction true? It's true at 2. Nice. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You're doing this.
I do have a question.
Please.
So, in the very first question, A conjunction B, we can. Oh no, sorry. Let's say second question.
Sure.
A conditional B. We look inside the box of world 2, but world 2 cannot see itself.
Yeah.
So does the relation only matter when we start using modal logic?
It does. So the only time we have to pay attention to accessibility relations is when we're thinking about how to make sense of those operators. So again, let's go back. This is why it's very helpful. When we think about the way that the TFL connectives work, they work just like they did before. We don't need to care about accessibility. It's just what's the case in the world. It's only once we start thinking about boxes and diamonds that we have to look at what worlds can it see. So every other time, if we're thinking about any sentences like these, cool. We don't care about what's happening at any other worlds. We just need to see what's going on there. Okay, cool. Now before we go on, we feel okay with this basic idea? So one of the really nice things, and this is kind of a peek behind the curtain, one of the reasons to develop modal logic and to think about it is we're thinking about this is necessity and this is possibility, but you don't have to. We could think about this as believes and possibly believes, or knows and believes. We can reinterpret these operators in lots of different ways and use this kind of structure to model all sorts of cool stuff. So this is one of the reasons why we've tried to be very flexible in terms of our modal logic. This is why we started off with 4 systems, because we want to try and think about what kind of options do we have here? How flexible can we be? But this is the kind of thing that I really want you guys to be able to do. I'm going to give you some kind of diagrammatic interpretation and then ask, hey, are these sentences true or false on this interpretation? So we'll do some more, but again, I just kind of want us to get there. The things to remember, just to reinforce, if we're doing any of these options, so atoms or sentences featuring the TFL connectives, you can just worry about the world. But as soon as you get these modal operators involved, boxes and diamonds, you've got to start worrying about the accessibility relations. And we can represent them in this very loose way. Worlds are these boxes, or maybe if I draw it, it might be circles, right? Atoms inside are true, negations inside mean the relevant atom is false, and the arrows represent accessibility. Cool? Please.
If you get a question regarding this on like the exam, will you get like the arrows? Because otherwise, how will you know if a world can see itself?
Yes, definitely. So if there were no, actually this is an interesting question. Let's think, suppose we deleted the arrows. Suppose we deleted the arrows. So we just had 2 worlds kind of floating in the void. What would that do for our modal operators? So interesting. Let's think about it, right? If we thought about our diamond operator in these worlds, right, where let's imagine we deleted all the blue arrows. We just have 2 worlds floating in the void. Are any diamond claims going to be true at either world? No, they couldn't be. So here's why. Remember, diamond claim is true at a world if and only if there is some world that it can see. So if there's no seeing, then there's no possibilities. Not even what's true at a given world would be possible relative to it because it can't see itself. It can't access itself. So these are off the table, basically. What about necessity claims? If we, again, deleted our arrows,
I think you get the same issue.
could be.
I think you could say, well, if A is true, then box A is also true.
So something really weird, right, is the way we've structured it.
But the world can't see, right?
The world can't see anything. But it says, hey, box A is true if and only if for every world that's accessible, it's true. So Michael probably talked to you about this. Did he use the example of people in Pokemon? Empty predicates? What happens with empty predicates? It's going to be vacuously true. We're going to get them vacuously true. And the reason they're going to turn out to be vacuously true is you're going to get something like this. There's a world, and at this world, so you're going to get these vacuous conditions. It's a very weird thing. You can also get gaps depending if you don't read in this condition. But if we delete the arrows, we get things very strange. Yeah.
Could you get an index with these relations, or will it always be a graph?
We can do it indexically if you find it easier. So you just literally list it off, right? So you'd say like at world 1, A and B are true, right? And then you can just talk about accessibility in terms of like that. If you find it easier, that's perfectly fine. Many people find the diagrams easier to read, so I'll do a diagram. Yeah?
Do you mind doing that consequent of the condition?
Yeah.
What does it say?
So this says at world WA. It's a way for us to say something like, this sentence is true at this world.
Okay.
It's weird because we technically don't have a way to say at a given world, but we have to kind of tweak the sentence a little bit. Okay. Please.
Did I miss something? Is it a really curvy A or did I miss something?
So it's in my sexy swash font, right? So it could be any given sentence you like. That was why. Yes. It's a very curvy A. Right. But that's why, because it could stand in for any sentence at all. Okay. So we feel kind of confident about these interpretations. We feel like you can read them, or at least got a grip on it, right? Okay. So let's wrap up with these, and this will take us basically to the break. An ML interpretation. An ML interpretation consists of 3 elements, right? We have a collection of worlds, right? And it's got to be non-empty. There has to be at least one world. We have a valuation function, which tells us which atoms are true and which atoms are false at the worlds in our collection. And then we have an accessibility relation, which tells us how the worlds see each other. And the nice thing is when we're building our interpretations, when we construct our own, we are totally unconstrained. You can have as many worlds as you like, or as few worlds as you like, as long as you have at least one. You can make atoms true or false in them as you like. And you can set the accessibility relation however you want. At least if we're working in K. And complex, non-modal sentences are true or false in a world, just like they were for TFL. Modal sentences are true in a world, depending on what's going on in all the worlds it can see. The diamond's true in a world if it can see at least one, where A is the case. And the box is true in a world if and only if every world it can see is an A world. Okay. So here's the neat thing. Our different systems, our 4 different systems we talked about with natural deduction, K, T, S4, and S5, they work exactly the same with this. The only thing that's different between those systems is the accessibility relation. We're going to talk about this next. But effectively, K is this one that we've just presented. There's no restrictions on how accessibility works. The other systems add in more and more restrictions. So they force accessibility to be a certain kind of way. And that's really the way we can play it from here. We'll talk about this same kind of thing. So building these interpretations and getting them to satisfy our various systems. K is easy. Draw whatever you want as long as there's at least one box. Once we move to T, we're going to have restrictions. There'll have to be certain kinds of arrows. And S4 and S5 build in additional arrows as well. So, okay. So, that's basically got to where I really wanted to get so far. Any more? Yes, please.
Do we always specify all atomic sentences in all worlds? So in our interpretation, let's say can you maybe go to...
Yeah. So if there was like a C in World 2, is that kind of what you're after?
What if in World 2 we took out the B?
Yeah. Good.
Can we still say that in World 1 box B?
So, this is nice. So what we're going to do is we're always going to assume that worlds are what we'll call complete. For every atom that we're thinking of, the atom is either true or false. That is, if we had like B was just gone from World 2, we would need to read it as B is false. We don't want to leave any logical gaps. Now nicely, this system is compatible with leaving gaps, but that will make everything that we've said much more complex. So we're not going to deal with it for us. We're going to still operate under the assumptions we had from lecture 1 of for every given sentence, it's going to be true or false. Now we just say it's true or false at a world. Yes? Good. So, if you remember from when we were talking about our natural reduction systems for modal logic, we had 4. So we had the single turnstile with K underneath it, and that is our weakest modal logic. And it's weakest because it says the accessibility relations can be however you want. The other systems, so we had T, we had S4, and we had S5. These add more and more restrictions on how accessibility needs to look. So we'll talk about that after the break. Cool. Okay, nice. Yeah, sorry. Oh, okay. Nice. So we're at 11:30. We take a 10-minute break. Is that okay? Back at 40? Perfect. Take a break and get some coffee. We'll go from there.